There are two kinds of data types in JavaScript, primitives and objects. Primitives are immutable, and that means once you create them, you cannot change them. Whereas object types or reference types are mutable, which means you can change them after you create them. We'll see what I mean by this with examples shortly. So let's take strings for example. A string in JavaScript is a group of characters put together between quotation marks like this, and strings are primitive data types. So let me create two identical strings like this, and when I check if the first phrase is equal to the second phrase, we'll get true, which kind of makes sense, I guess. And I can also use console log to print the results like this too. But the main point is these two phrases are equal by value. What do I mean by that? These two strings are primitive types, and primitive types are compared by comparing the values that they represent. So is there any other way of comparing stuff? Well, actually there is. There is a second data type in JavaScript, and that is object type. And one way of creating an object is using an object literal like this. So let's create two of them. And although these two objects look similar, when you compare them you'll get false, because they are actually references to two separate objects. Again, the main difference between an object or a reference type and a primitive type is, when you compare objects, you compare references, not values. But although these objects are reference types, these name properties or attributes are strings, and strings are primitive data types, also known as value types. So when we compare the names of these two objects, we get true since these two names have identical values, and value types or primitives are compared by their values. The main take from this exercise is primitive types are compared by value and object types are compared by reference. Another thing about primitive types is that they are immutable, that is, once they are set, you cannot modify them. So for example, if we have this string variable called URL, we can access its first character like this. So if we try to modify that first character by assigning a different letter to it, and when we print the string back again, it will still display the original value. So we are unable to change it or mutate it because primitive types are immutable, they cannot change. But if our variable was an array of characters like this, which array is an object type, which is mutable, we could be able to mutate it or change it. So when we did the same replacement, we'd observe that our array has changed because arrays are reference types and reference types are mutable. Since object types or reference types are mutable, you can also add properties or attributes to them as well. So I can add a from attribute or a from property to this object and print it like this. However, when I try to add the same property to a primitive type and then print it, I'll get undefined because primitives are immutable, and once you set them, there is no way to modify them. So yeah, primitive types or value types don't have properties or attributes because they are immutable. On the other hand, objects have properties because you can change or mutate them. We'll do another little experiment. I'll create one string variable called URL1 and assign it this value, which is a primitive string, and then I'll create another string variable URL2 and assign the value of this string to it. Then I replace URL2 with another string. Then when I log them, you can see that the first variable remains the same and the second variable has changed, which is kind of expected again, I think. So let's do something similar with reference types as well. I have this character1. I'll assign a reference to character1 to character2, and now both of these variables hold a reference to the same object. So when I change the name of character2 and log these two objects, you'll see that the names of both of the variables have changed because both of these variables point to the same object reference. Every type in JavaScript has an in-memory representation or value. The in-memory value of a primitive type is the value of the variable itself, and the in-memory value of an object type is a reference to the object. That's why when we compare two primitives with equal values, we get true, because we compare the in-memory representation of them, which are the same as the values that they represent. And when we compare two separate objects, we get false, because we compare their references, which are their locations in the memory, which are their memory addresses, and those references point to two different locations in the memory, and therefore they are not equal. Which also means when we compare any kind of variables, either reference type or value type, we actually always compare values. When we compare object types, the values that we compare are their memory locations, and when we compare primitive types, the values that we compare are their actual values. But for the sake of simplicity and ease of remembering, we say that value types are compared and passed by value, and reference types are compared and passed by reference. Primitive types are immutable, they are compared by value, and they are passed by value, and they don't have properties, whereas reference types are mutable, they are compared and passed by reference, and they do have properties. If all of these sound a little confusing, don't you worry. We'll see lots of examples in the upcoming lessons to clarify things, and in the next lesson we'll dive further into JavaScript primitives. But for this lesson, that's all there is to it, so see you in the next lesson.